I'm in Mosby 40, an Army intelligence officer who worked my way from a quiet suburban kid to leading high-stakes counterintelligence missions. For years, I showed up for my family, time, money, loyalty, while staying silent about what my service actually demanded. But when my father dismissed me, out loud, at a formal recognition ceremony, and a four-star general stepped in to correct him, I drew a line that changed everything. Have you ever been minimized or blindsided by someone you've backed your whole life? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not the only one. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being written off, tap like and subscribe for more grounded, first-person stories about boundaries and self-respect. What came next might surprise you. I learned early that my father's approval was currency I could never quite earn, no matter how perfectly I stacked the coins. Growing up in our suburban house with its pristine lawn and American flag hanging from the front porch, I understood that achievement was expected, not celebrated. My report cards came home marked with A's, and Dad would glance at them before setting them aside. "Good," he'd say, already turning back to his newspaper. "Keep it up." My mother would catch my eye across the dinner table and offer a small smile, but she never challenged his restraint. In our family, Dad's word was law, his opinion the final verdict on everything from college choices to weekend plans. When I made honor roll for the third consecutive semester, he nodded once and mentioned that my cousin Sarah had just gotten into pre-med at Johns Hopkins. When I won the state championship in debate, he reminded me that talking wasn't the same as doing. The pattern established itself before I even understood what was happening. I'd present him with some accomplishment, some proof of my worth, and he'd find the flaw, the missing piece, the reason it wasn't quite enough. Not cruel, exactly, but relentlessly measured. I began to think of our conversations as performance reviews where the standards shifted just beyond my reach. "Excellence is expected in this family," he'd say when relatives praised my achievements. "We don't celebrate doing what you're supposed to do." By high school, I'd internalized his voice so completely that I barely needed him to deliver the assessments anymore. I could anticipate his responses, feel the weight of his judgment before he even spoke. When I was accepted to West Point, I remember standing in the kitchen, holding the letter, preparing myself for his reaction. He read it twice, handed it back to me, and said, "Don't let it go to your head. The real work starts now." My mother hugged me that day, tears in her eyes, whispering congratulations. But it was his approval I craved, his recognition I needed. I told myself that military service would finally prove my worth to him. Surely, serving my country would meet his standards. Surely, dedication to something larger than myself would earn his respect. At West Point, I threw myself into everything with the intensity of someone trying to fill a void. I excelled in tactics, leadership, physical training. I graduated near the top of my class, commissioned as a second lieutenant with honors. Dad attended the ceremony, shook hands with my commanding officer, told people his daughter was doing well. Doing well. Not exceptional. Not outstanding. Well. My first deployment was to Afghanistan. I wrote him letters describing the responsibility, the weight of leading soldiers, the complexity of operations I couldn't fully detail. His responses were brief, practical. "Stay safe. Do your job. Make good decisions." When I came home on leave, he'd ask general questions about the food, the weather, the equipment, but never about the work itself, never about the moments that tested me or the decisions that kept me awake at night. Other parents asked about their children's service with hunger in their eyes, desperate for details, proud of stories they could barely understand. Dad treated my military career like a job at an accounting firm. Steady work. Decent benefits. Nothing to get excited about. I watched him light up when he talked about his golf partner's children. Sarah, the doctor, who was saving lives. Mike's boy, who'd started his own construction company. Jenny's daughter, the teacher, who was shaping young minds. Meaningful work, he called it. Work that mattered. When people asked about me, he'd mention I was stationed overseas or still in the army, his tone suggesting it was a phase I'd eventually grow out of. The irony wasn't lost on me. While he dismissed my service as routine, I was developing expertise in counterintelligence, leading complex operations, earning commendations that I couldn't discuss with anyone outside my security clearance level. The work that consumed my life, that demanded every skill I developed and then some, barely registered on his radar as real achievement. During a rare phone call from a forward operating base, he asked when I planned to settle down, maybe use my military experience to get a real job in security or law enforcement. As if the years I'd dedicated to serving my country were just elaborate job training for something more legitimate. I remember holding the satellite phone, staring out at the Afghan mountains, wondering how to explain that this was my real job, that the responsibility I carried was more significant than he could imagine. My promotions came regularly. Captain, then major, each advancement accompanied by increased responsibility and respect from my colleagues. But when I called home with the news, Dad's responses remained consistent. Good for you. Don't let it go to your head. He seemed more interested in telling me about his neighbor's promotion at the insurance company, a position that came with a company car and better health benefits. I began to understand that in his mind, I was still the little girl trying too hard to impress him, still chasing validation for achievements he couldn't quite bring himself to acknowledge. The uniform, the rank, the security clearance, the classified operations, none of it translated into the kind of success he could brag about at the country club or the Legion Hall. The distance between us grew with each deployment, each promotion, each mission I couldn't discuss. I stopped calling as frequently, stopped sharing details about my career progression. What was the point? He'd already decided what my service meant, and no amount of evidence would change his assessment. By the time I reached lieutenant colonel, I'd learned to find validation elsewhere, from my superiors, from my peers, from the soldiers I led. But that original hunger for his approval never fully disappeared. It just went underground, surfacing at unexpected moments, catching me off guard with its persistence. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was doing meaningful work whether he recognized it or not. I told myself his opinion was just one voice among many. But late at night, in whatever temporary quarters I called home, I still imagined the conversation where he'd finally understand, finally see me clearly, finally say he was proud. That conversation never came. Instead, what came was something I never expected, something that would expose the depth of his blindness and change everything between us forever. But I didn't know that yet. I was still hoping, still believing that someday, somehow, I'd find the right combination of achievement and dedication that would unlock his recognition. I was still his daughter, still seeking his approval, still convinced that if I just tried a little harder, served a little longer, achieved a little more, he'd finally see me for who I'd become. The shift in my father's attitude became noticeable when I made lieutenant colonel. Where once his dismissal felt like indifference, now it carried an edge of active skepticism. The promotion came with a ceremony, nothing elaborate, but significant enough that family members typically attended. I called him 2 weeks in advance, explained the date, mentioned that other officers' families would be there. "I'll see if I can make it," he said, in the tone people use when they're already planning to decline. He didn't make it. When I called afterward, he asked how it went, then immediately shifted to talking about his golf game and how well his partner's son was doing in pharmaceutical sales. Real achievement, he seemed to suggest. Measurable success. The pattern intensified over the months that followed. During my brief leave visits home, he'd listen to my careful, unclassified descriptions of my work with barely concealed impatience, then redirect the conversation to his friends' children and their accomplishments. The orthodontist's daughter who'd just bought her second dental practice. The banker's son who'd made partner at his law firm. Success stories he could understand, quantify, repeat at the Rotary Club. "Those medals don't make you a legend," he said one evening, glancing at the service ribbons on my dress uniform hanging in the closet. I'd worn it to a retirement ceremony for a colonel who'd served 3 decades. Dad had been sorting through mail when I returned, and something about seeing the uniform seemed to irritate him. "I never said they did," I replied, but he'd already moved on, absorbed in a conversation about property taxes and neighborhood association politics. His social circle had evolved during my deployments. The men he spent time with now, veterans from Vietnam and earlier conflicts, successful businessmen, community leaders, shared a particular view of military service. They respected combat veterans, especially those with dramatic stories and visible scars. They understood heroism that fit familiar narratives, valor under fire, impossible odds, life and death decisions made in jungle clearings or desert compounds. My work didn't fit their template. Intelligence operations, strategic planning, counterterrorism coordination, these weren't stories that translated well to dinner parties. The successes I couldn't discuss, the missions that remained classified, the complex diplomatic and military objectives I helped achieve, none of it registered as real military service in his evolving worldview. "She's still over there doing her thing," he'd tell people who asked about me, his tone suggesting mild bewilderment at my career choices. Paperwork, mostly. Administrative stuff. The characterization stung because it was so fundamentally wrong, yet I couldn't correct it without violating operational security. I couldn't explain that my administrative stuff involved coordinating with special operations units, analyzing threats that could affect thousands of lives, or developing strategies that influence policy at the highest levels of government. During one particularly frustrating conversation, he mentioned a neighbor's son who'd recently returned from a deployment as a staff sergeant in the infantry. "Now that's real soldiering," Dad said with more enthusiasm than he'd ever shown for my career. Ground combat. Life on the line. That boy's got stories. I wanted to explain that military service takes many forms, that strategic operations and ground combat are both essential, that the missions I supported often involved the same risks and demanded the same courage as direct engagement. But he'd already formed his opinion. In his mind, I was an officer who worked behind desks while real soldiers faced danger. His friends reinforced this perspective. They'd grown up on World War II movies and Vietnam memoirs, stories of clear enemies and dramatic firefights. The modern military's complexity, its emphasis on intelligence, technology, diplomatic coordination, and strategic thinking, didn't fit their understanding of heroism. I was a woman in a uniform doing work they couldn't categorize, therefore work that couldn't be truly important. The irony was profound. While he dismissed my service as routine bureaucracy, I was part of operations that prevented terrorist attacks, coordinated international security efforts, and contributed to strategic victories that never made headlines precisely because they succeeded. The absence of drama, the lack of publicized heroics, was often the mark of missions accomplished successfully. I tried different approaches to bridge the gap. I spoke about leadership challenges, the responsibility of commanding personnel, the satisfaction of training effective teams. He'd nod politely, then change the subject to his golf partner's son, who'd just opened a successful restaurant franchise. Tangible achievement. Profit margins and expansion plans. The breaking point came during a family barbecue when his friend Bob started talking about his nephew, a Marine who'd done 2 tours in Iraq. Dad listened with genuine interest, asked detailed questions, expressed real admiration. When Bob finished his story, Dad looked at me and said, "Maybe you can learn something from boys like that." Real military service. I felt something crystallize in that moment, a recognition that no amount of explanation or achievement would change his perspective. He decided what my service meant, and evidence to the contrary wouldn't penetrate his assumptions. I was his daughter who'd chosen an extended adventure in uniform rather than a serious career, still playing soldier while others did meaningful work. The conversation that evening convinced me that his dismissal wasn't just ignorance, it was willful blindness. He constructed a narrative about military service that excluded my experience, and maintaining that narrative was more important than understanding his daughter's actual contributions. I stopped trying to explain after that. When he asked about my work, I gave brief, generic responses. When he compared me unfavorably to other people's children, I nodded and changed the subject. The distance between us widened not because I stopped caring about his opinion, but because I finally understood that his opinion was based on fundamental misunderstandings he had no interest in correcting. What I didn't know was that this willful ignorance would eventually expose him publicly in a way that would force him to confront the gap between his assumptions and reality. That reckoning was coming, though neither of us could see it approaching. For now, I simply endured his dismissal, focused on my actual responsibilities, and tried to find peace with the fact that my father would never understand the daughter he'd raised or the service member she'd become. The invitation arrived on official letterhead, thick paper with embossed seals that immediately caught my attention. The ceremony was being held to recognize military personnel who had demonstrated exceptional service in counterintelligence operations. I read the formal language twice, understanding that this wasn't routine recognition. This was acknowledgement of work that typically remained invisible. I called my parents that evening, explaining that I'd been selected for a significant honor and would be recognized alongside other officers and senior enlisted personnel. The ceremony would be formal, attended by high-ranking officials and family members. I mentioned that spouses, children, and parents were specifically invited. "We'll see," Dad said, which had become his standard response to military events. "Depends on what else is going on." 3 days before the ceremony, I called again to confirm their attendance. Mom answered and said they'd discussed it, but Dad wasn't sure the drive was worth it for another military thing. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, but kept my voice steady. "It would mean a lot to have you there," I said. "We'll try," she replied, but her tone suggested the decision had already been made. They came. I saw them arrive as I was checking in with the protocol officer, Dad in his best suit, Mom in the dress she wore to church. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anxiety. Would he understand the significance of this recognition? Would he finally see that my service had meaning beyond his narrow definitions? The venue was impressive, a military facility with polished floors and flag displays, filled with dress uniforms and civilians in formal attire. Other honorees moved through the crowd with their families, everyone speaking in the subdued tones that military ceremonies inspire. I introduced my parents to colleagues, watched Dad shake hands and make polite conversation. The ceremony began with the usual protocols: presentation of colors, national anthem, invocation. I stood with the other honorees in the front section, aware that my parents were somewhere behind me in the audience. The presiding officer, a 2-star general, began explaining the nature of the recognition, the classified work that couldn't be detailed publicly, the strategic importance of intelligence operations in modern military doctrine. The men and women being honored today have served with distinction in roles that demand exceptional skill, judgment, and dedication, the general said. Their work often goes unrecognized because success in their field means threats are neutralized before they become public knowledge. I felt a moment of hope. Maybe this explanation would help Dad understand that my service had significance even if he couldn't see dramatic battlefield stories or quantifiable results. The ceremony proceeded through individual recognitions. Each honoree's name was called, their rank announced, and a brief, necessarily vague, description of their contributions was read. When my turn came, I walked to the front, stood at attention while the citation was read, accepted the medal and certificate, and returned to my seat. That's when I heard him. "Only legends are invited, not you." The words carried across the ceremonial quiet, spoken loudly enough that multiple people turned to look. I felt heat rush to my face, the immediate shame of public humiliation mixed with disbelief that he would choose this moment, this place, to voice his dismissal. I turned and saw him standing near the back, addressing me directly, his voice cutting through the respectful atmosphere like a blade. Other family members looked uncomfortable, some shocked. Officers and senior enlisted personnel stared, clearly wondering what would prompt such a statement at a recognition ceremony. My first instinct was to shrink, to step back and disappear, to minimize the scene he was creating. The mortification was complete, humiliated in front of colleagues, superiors, and peers by my own father's public dismissal of my service. I wanted to find the nearest exit, to escape the stares and whispered conversations that would inevitably follow. But before I could move, a figure stepped forward from the front row. For stars gleamed on his shoulders, a rank that commanded immediate attention from everyone in the room. The general who had been observing the ceremony approached my father with measured steps, his expression serious but controlled. "Sir," the general said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command, "do you not know who your own daughter is?" The room fell completely silent. Every conversation stopped, every person focused on the exchange taking place near the back of the ceremonial space. Dad looked suddenly uncertain, no longer the confident critic who had just dismissed my achievements. The general continued, his voice clear enough for most of the audience to hear. "Your daughter has served with distinction in operations that have prevented terrorist attacks on American soil. She has coordinated intelligence efforts that have saved countless lives. She has led teams in high-risk environments and demonstrated the kind of leadership and strategic thinking that makes her invaluable to our national security." I watched my father's expression change, confusion replacing certainty. The general wasn't finished. "The work she does is classified for good reason, but I can tell you that her contributions to counterintelligence operations have been exceptional. She has earned the respect of her peers and superiors through competence, dedication, and courage. The recognition she's receiving today represents achievements that most people will never know about because her success means threats were eliminated before they could harm American citizens." The silence stretched. Other audience members, including military personnel who understood the weight of a four-star general's words, looked from the general to my father to me. The humiliation I'd felt moments earlier transformed into something else, not pride, exactly, but a kind of vindication that I'd never expected to experience. Dad stood there, clearly struggling to process what he'd just heard. The man he dismissed as doing paperwork and administrative stuff had just been described by one of the military's highest-ranking officers as exceptional, valuable, and courageous. "She is exactly the kind of legend we need in today's military," the general concluded, then turned and walked back to his seat, leaving my father standing alone, exposed in his ignorance. The ceremony continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. People kept glancing back at Dad, then at me, clearly processing what they'd witnessed. The public reversal of his judgment, delivered by someone whose opinion carried undeniable weight, had revealed not just his ignorance, but his willingness to humiliate his daughter based on that ignorance. When the event concluded and people began moving toward the reception, colleagues approached me with expressions of support and disbelief. "I can't believe he said that," one said, "after what the general explained about your work." Others simply shook their heads, their disapproval clear. My father remained near the back of the room, no longer holding court or expressing opinions. The confident man who had publicly dismissed my service now looked uncertain, diminished by his own words and the general's response. Mom approached me first, tears in her eyes, and whispered an apology I wasn't sure she had the right to make on his behalf. The ceremony that was supposed to recognize my service had become something else entirely, a public revelation of my father's blindness and my actual worth, witnessed by the very community whose respect I'd earned through years of dedicated service. The drive home from the ceremony passed in uncomfortable silence. I followed my parents' car to their house, my mind replaying the general's words and the expressions on people's faces. The weight of public vindication mixed with the sting of having needed it in the first place. By the time we reached their driveway, I still wasn't sure what I wanted to say. Dad went straight to his study when we got inside, closing the door behind him. Mom hovered in the kitchen, making coffee no one wanted, her movements nervous and apologetic. I sat at the dining room table where I'd done homework decades earlier, trying to process what had happened. "He didn't know," Mom said finally, setting down a cup I hadn't asked for. "About your work, I mean. He really didn't understand." "That was obvious," I replied, not unkindly but without softening the reality. She sat across from me, hands wrapped around her own cup. "He's proud of you. He just doesn't know how to show it." The familiar excuse hung between us. How many times had I heard variations of this explanation over the years? He's proud but doesn't show it. He cares but expresses it differently. He means well but struggles with emotions. The litany of justifications that had trained me to accept his dismissal as a form of love I was supposed to decode. Being proud and publicly humiliating someone are different things, I said. She had no answer for that. We sat in the quiet house, listening to the grandfather clock tick in the hallway and the muffled sounds of Dad moving around in his study. I wondered what he was doing in there, whether he was processing the general's words or finding ways to minimize their significance. My phone buzzed with text messages from colleagues who'd been at the ceremony. Expressions of support, invitations to dinner, affirmations of respect that felt both gratifying and necessary. The military community had witnessed my father's dismissal and the general's defense, and their response was unambiguously supportive. They understood what my work meant, even if they couldn't know the details. Colonel Martinez, my immediate superior, had pulled me aside after the ceremony. That was completely inappropriate, she'd said, referring to Dad's outburst. But I'm glad people heard what the general said about your contributions. Maybe more people need to understand what modern military service actually looks like. She was right. The incident had inadvertently highlighted how little civilians understood about contemporary military operations, especially the intelligence and strategic work that happened away from traditional combat zones. My father's ignorance wasn't unique. It reflected broader misunderstandings about what military service involved in the 21st century. But knowing that didn't diminish the personal impact. This wasn't about public education or civilian-military relations. This was about my father's willingness to humiliate his daughter based on assumptions he'd never bothered to examine. The study door opened, and Dad emerged looking older than he had that morning. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself coffee, then came to the dining room and sat down without making eye contact. "I didn't know about your work," he said finally. "You never asked." I thought. He stopped, started again. "I thought you were doing support work. Administrative things." "You thought wrong." The conversation felt fragile, like we were negotiating around something that might shatter if we applied too much pressure. But I was tired of protecting his feelings at the expense of my dignity. "That general," Dad said, "he seemed to know you personally. We've worked together. He's familiar with my record. He said you prevented terrorist attacks. I can't discuss operational details. You know that." Dad nodded, though I wasn't sure he'd ever really understood the constraints of security clearances. For him, work was something you talked about over dinner, something you explained to neighbors, something you could brag about or complain about freely. The classified nature of my responsibilities had always been abstract to him. "I wish you could have told me," he said. The statement revealed so much about his perspective, the assumption that my failure to explain was the problem, not his failure to respect what I couldn't explain. Even now, faced with evidence of his misjudgment, he was framing it as a communication issue rather than a failure of trust and support. "I told you everything I could," I said. "I told you I was serving my country, taking on responsibility, working with dedicated people on important missions. You dismissed all of it because it didn't fit your idea of what military service should look like." The words hung between us, harder than I'd intended, but not harder than they needed to be. This wasn't just about today's humiliation, it was about years of subtle dismissal, of comparisons to other people's children, of feeling like my service was a phase I'd eventually outgrow rather than a calling I'd embraced. "I'm sorry," he said, the words quiet but clear. "For what, specifically?" "For what I said today. For embarrassing you." It was a start, but it wasn't enough. The apology addressed the symptom, not the disease. The public humiliation was just the most visible manifestation of a deeper problem, his inability to value my choices, my service, my dedication to something larger than myself. "I need time to think," I told him, "about how we move forward from here." Mom looked stricken, as if I'd threatened to disappear forever. But Dad seemed to understand that the damage wasn't something that could be repaired with a simple apology. The general's words had exposed not just his ignorance, but the years of dismissal that had led to today's confrontation. I finished my coffee and prepared to leave. The ceremony that morning felt like it had happened weeks ago rather than hours. I was the same person who'd been recognized for exceptional service, but the family dynamic that had shaped my entire relationship with achievement had shifted irrevocably. As I drove back to my temporary quarters, I realized that the general's defense, while gratifying, had also clarified something important. I no longer needed my father's approval to validate my choices. The respect of my colleagues, the recognition of my superiors, and my own knowledge of my contributions were sufficient. The question now wasn't whether Dad would finally understand my worth. It was whether I was willing to keep trying to earn something that should have been freely given years ago. The days following the ceremony brought an unexpected clarity about family dynamics I'd accepted for years. I returned to duty with a strange sense of lightness, as if some weight I'd carried unconsciously had finally been lifted. The General's public defense had done more than vindicate my service. It had freed me from the exhausting pursuit of approval that would never come. My phone showed several missed calls from home, but I didn't return them immediately. I needed space to process what had happened and decide how to respond. The military has a useful concept called after-action review, analyzing what went right, what went wrong, and what lessons should be applied going forward. I applied that framework to my relationship with my father. What went right? I'd served my country with distinction, earned the respect of my colleagues, and contributed meaningfully to national security. What went wrong? I'd spent years trying to earn recognition from someone who was fundamentally unable to provide it. What to apply going forward? I needed to stop making his approval a condition of my self-worth. The realization was both liberating and painful. Liberating because it freed me from an impossible standard. Painful because it meant acknowledging that the father-daughter relationship I'd always wanted might never exist. Colonel Martinez called me into her office 3 days later. "That was quite a scene at the ceremony," she said, but her tone was supportive rather than critical. "The General mentioned that he'd known about your work for some time and was glad to finally speak publicly about your contributions." "I appreciate his support," I said. "He also mentioned that family relationships can be complicated when your work requires security clearances. Some people struggle to respect what they can't understand." It was a diplomatic way of addressing what everyone had witnessed. Military families often dealt with the challenge of supporting careers they couldn't fully comprehend, work that required discretion and sacrifice, but offered little public recognition. "I've been thinking about boundaries," I said. "Professional ones, but also personal ones." Colonel Martinez nodded. "That's often necessary. Not everyone in your life will understand or support your choices. Part of leadership is knowing when to seek approval and when to proceed based on your own judgment." The conversation helped me articulate something I'd been feeling. My father's opinion had become a distraction from my actual responsibilities. While I'd been focused on earning his respect, I'd been succeeding in areas that actually mattered: my duty, my colleagues' trust, my contribution to critical missions. When I finally called home, Mom answered with obvious relief. "I'm so glad you called. Your father's been upset since the ceremony. He wants to talk to you." "I'm sure he does," I said. "But I'm not ready for that conversation yet." "Please don't cut us out of your life," she pleaded. "He's trying to understand." The request revealed her fear, but also her misunderstanding of the situation. I wasn't cutting anyone out. I was simply refusing to center my life around someone else's approval. There's a difference between maintaining family relationships and subordinating your dignity to maintain family peace. "I'm not cutting anyone out," I explained. "But I'm also not going to pretend that what happened was just a misunderstanding." It was a pattern that came to a head publicly. Over the following weeks, Dad made various attempts at reconciliation. Flowers delivered to my office. A card expressing pride in my service. Phone messages suggesting we get together to talk. Each gesture felt like damage control rather than genuine change, efforts to repair the immediate crisis without addressing the underlying issues. I responded minimally but not hostilely. Thank you notes for the flowers. Brief acknowledgments of his messages. Polite but reserved responses that maintained connection without rewarding behavior that had taken years to develop and wouldn't disappear overnight. The shift in dynamic became apparent during a family gathering several weeks later. Extended relatives who'd heard about the ceremony through family networks treated me differently, with curiosity about my work, respect for my service, questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite conversation. Dad participated in these conversations, but tentatively, no longer holding forth with authority about military service or career choices. When someone asked about my recognition, he deferred to me rather than offering his own interpretation. The confident dismissal that had characterized our interactions for years was replaced by uncertainty. Your father's been reading about intelligence operations, Mom told me privately during that gathering. Articles about counterterrorism, books about modern warfare. I think he's trying to understand. The effort was noteworthy, but it also highlighted how little he'd known about my actual work. He'd spent years forming opinions about my career without basic knowledge about what that career involved. The reading was a start, but it couldn't undo the years of dismissal or the public humiliation that had exposed his ignorance. I began to understand that the real change wasn't whether Dad would finally respect my service. It was my own liberation from needing that respect to feel complete. The general's words had been powerful not because they convinced my father, but because they confirmed what my colleagues and I already knew: my work had value independent of his approval. This shift affected how I approached family interactions going forward. I participated in conversations without the underlying tension of seeking validation. I shared what I could about my work without frustration at his inability to fully understand it. I maintained relationships without subordinating my self-worth to others' opinions. The boundary I'd established wasn't a wall, it was a recognition that some people in your life will support your choices, some will question them, and some will never fully understand them. The key is knowing which reactions matter and which ones you can acknowledge without internalizing. My father's journey toward understanding my service would continue, but it was no longer my responsibility to guide that process or wait for its completion to feel proud of my contributions. I'd spent too many years seeking his approval to waste more time resenting its absence. The ceremony had ended one chapter of our relationship and begun another, one where mutual respect would need to be earned rather than assumed, where my achievements stood on their own merit, and where his opinion was just one voice among many rather than the ultimate measure of my worth. 6 months after the ceremony, something interesting began happening to my father's social standing. The story of his public confrontation with a 4-star general had spread through his social circles, but not in the way he might have hoped. Instead of sympathy for a misunderstood parent, people seemed to view the incident as evidence of poor judgment and disrespect for military service. Bob, his golf partner who'd previously regaled the group with stories of his Marine nephew, mentioned during one of their regular games that he'd heard about the ceremony. "Hell of a thing," Bob said, according to Mom's later account. "Having a 4-star dress you down in public like that makes a man wonder what he was thinking." The comment stung because it came from someone whose military stories Dad had always celebrated, someone who represented the kind of service he claimed to respect. Bob's disapproval carried weight precisely because it came from within Dad's established hierarchy of whose opinions mattered. Other members of his social circle responded similarly. At the Rotary Club, conversations about military appreciation took on subtle undertones. When Dad tried to contribute to discussions about supporting veterans, people listened politely but without the deference he'd previously commanded. His authority on military matters, never formally established but socially accepted, had been publicly undermined. The shift wasn't dramatic or cruel, but it was unmistakable. People who'd previously sought his opinions on various topics began looking elsewhere for guidance. His confidence in social settings diminished as he navigated the unspoken, but clear understanding that his judgment had been found lacking by someone whose expertise was unquestionable. Meanwhile, my own professional life continued to thrive. The recognition ceremony had raised my profile within military circles, leading to new opportunities and increased responsibilities. I was selected for a position that would involve coordinating with multiple agencies on strategic initiatives, work that built on my existing expertise, but expanded my influence significantly. The irony wasn't lost on me. As Dad's social standing suffered from his dismissal of my service, my career was advancing because of that same service he'd never understood. The gap between his perceptions and reality had been exposed not just to our family, but to the communities that shaped his identity. I learned about his social difficulties through Mom, who'd become something of a bridge between us. Her reports weren't intended to make me feel sorry for him, but rather to help me understand the broader consequences of the ceremony. Dad was experiencing firsthand how quickly social dynamics could shift when fundamental assumptions were proven wrong. "He's embarrassed," she told me during one of our occasional phone calls. "Not just about what happened at the ceremony, but about how long he was wrong about your work." Understanding the work was never the issue, I replied. Respecting me despite not understanding it should have been automatic. The distinction was important. Many military families navigate the challenge of supporting careers they can't fully comprehend. Spouses, parents, and children learn to trust that their service members are engaged in meaningful work even when operational security prevents detailed explanations. Dad's problem hadn't been ignorance, it had been his unwillingness to extend basic respect in the absence of complete understanding. His attempts at reconciliation evolved during this period. Instead of generic expressions of pride, he began asking specific questions about military structure, trying to understand rank systems and career progression. He subscribed to military publications, attended veterans events, even contacted the local VFW about volunteer opportunities. The effort was genuine, but it also highlighted the depth of his previous disengagement. He was essentially starting from scratch to understand an institution his daughter had served in for over a decade. The learning curve was steep, and the humility it required was clearly difficult for someone who'd prided himself on authoritative opinions. I watched this process with mixed emotions. Appreciation for his belated effort. Frustration that it had taken public embarrassment to motivate change. Sadness that we'd lost years to his stubborn assumptions. But also a growing sense of my own independence from the outcome. Whether Dad eventually developed genuine understanding of military service mattered less than my own clarity about the value of my work. The general's defense had been validating, but the real transformation was internal, my recognition that seeking approval from someone unwilling to grant it was a form of self-sabotage. My colleagues had noticed the change in my demeanor. "You seem more settled," Colonel Martinez observed during a routine evaluation. "More confident in your own assessment of situations." She was right. Without the constant background noise of seeking external validation, I could focus more completely on the work itself. The professional recognition continued. I was invited to brief senior leadership on strategic initiatives, consulted on policy development, asked to mentor junior officers navigating their own career paths. These opportunities came not because I'd finally earned my father's approval, but because I'd demonstrated confidence over years of dedicated service. Dad's social rehabilitation was slower and more complicated. Some relationships recovered as people recognized his efforts to understand his mistake. Others remained cool, particularly among veterans who viewed his public dismissal of military service as fundamentally disrespectful. He was learning that reputations, once damaged, require time and consistent behavior to repair. The country club conversations that had once revolved around his confident opinions now proceeded without his central participation. He attended events, maintained friendships, participated in activities, but from a more humble position. The authority he'd wielded through force of personality had been replaced by the need to rebuild credibility through demonstrated understanding. I found myself feeling neither satisfaction nor sympathy about his changed circumstances. His social difficulties were the natural consequence of his own choices, but they weren't my primary concern. I'd moved beyond the need for his social validation or his social suffering to somehow balance the scales of our relationship. What mattered was that I was finally free from the exhausting cycle of seeking approval that would never satisfy either of us. He could continue his journey toward understanding my service, or not. He could rebuild his social standing, or not. He could develop genuine respect for military families, or not. Those outcomes would affect him more than me. The distance I'd established wasn't punitive, it was protective. I maintained cordial contact, participated in family events, and responded to his efforts at reconciliation with appropriate recognition. But I no longer invested emotional energy in managing his opinions or reactions. The relationship had evolved from one of dependency to one of choice. This shift liberated mental and emotional resources for more productive purposes. My work performance improved as I stopped second-guessing decisions based on imaginary criticism from someone whose expertise had proven questionable. My personal relationships deepened as I stopped filtering experiences through the lens of what would finally impress him. The boundary I'd established served both of us, though he might not have recognized it initially. It freed him from the impossible task of providing approval he was temperamentally unable to give, and it freed me from the futile pursuit of validation that had shaped too many of my choices. By the time a full year had passed since the ceremony, we'd settled into a new equilibrium. Dad's social difficulties had largely resolved as people moved on to other topics, and his consistent efforts to understand military service gradually restored some respect. My own career had continued advancing, with new responsibilities that reflected my growing expertise and leadership capabilities. The ceremony that had exposed our dysfunctional dynamic had ultimately served as a catalyst for necessary change. Not change that repaired our relationship in traditional terms, but change that allowed both of us to interact from positions of greater honesty and self-respect. 2 years after the ceremony, Dad made his first significant gesture toward genuine reconciliation. He called to tell me he'd been volunteering at the local VA hospital, helping with administrative tasks and visiting patients who didn't receive regular family visits. The work was unglamorous, filing paperwork, delivering mail, sitting with isolated veterans, but he'd been doing it consistently for months before mentioning it to anyone. "I wanted to understand what service really meant," he said during that phone call. "Not just the ceremonies and the recognition, but the day-to-day commitment and sacrifice." The VA work had educated him in ways that books and articles couldn't. He'd met veterans from multiple generations, heard stories of military service that didn't fit Hollywood narratives, learned about the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. Most importantly, he'd observed the quiet dignity of people who dedicated years to serving something larger than themselves. "Some of these guys never saw combat," he continued. "They did communications, logistics, intelligence work. But they all sacrificed for their country, and they all deserve respect." The admission was significant because it acknowledged that his previous understanding of military service had been narrow and inadequate. The VA patients had taught him what I'd been unable to explain, that meaningful service takes many forms, that heroism often lacks drama, that dedication to duty matters regardless of whether it generates compelling stories. I appreciated the gesture but remained cautious about interpreting its meaning. People can change their understanding without changing their fundamental approach to relationships. Dad's new awareness of military service didn't automatically address his pattern of withholding approval or his tendency to dismiss achievements that didn't meet his arbitrary standards. "I'm glad you're finding the volunteer work meaningful," I said, keeping my response measured. "I want you to know that I understand now," he replied. "What you've been doing, the importance of your work. I was wrong to dismiss it." The apology was more substantive than his previous attempts, rooted in genuine understanding rather than damage control. But I'd learned to evaluate changes in behavior over time rather than accepting promises of transformation based on single conversations. Over the following months, his approach to our interactions shifted noticeably. He asked questions about my work that demonstrated actual interest rather than polite conversation. He stopped making comparisons between my career and other people's life choices. He spoke about military service with newfound respect when the topic arose in family gatherings. The changes were positive, but they also highlighted how much damage had been done over the years. Trust, once broken by repeated dismissal and public humiliation, required consistent effort to rebuild. I appreciated his growth while maintaining the emotional boundaries that protected my well-being. The most significant moment came during a family dinner when my cousin Sarah, the doctor he'd frequently held up as an example of real achievement, mentioned her own struggles with work-life balance and professional satisfaction. Dad listened supportively, offered encouragement, and refrained from minimizing her concerns or comparing her situation to others. After Sarah left, he turned to me and said, "I used to think success was simple to measure. Income, recognition, things you could point to. But everyone's path is different, and everyone's contributions matter in ways that aren't always visible." The observation suggested a broader evolution in his thinking, not just about military service, but about achievement and worth generally. The rigid hierarchies he'd used to evaluate people's choices had given way to a more nuanced understanding of life's complexity. I began to allow for the possibility of genuine reconciliation, though on terms very different from what either of us might have imagined years earlier. This wouldn't be a return to seeking his approval or acceptance of his previous dismissal as somehow justified. Instead, it would be a careful rebuilding based on mutual respect and his demonstrated commitment to change. The process was gradual and sometimes awkward. He struggled with the unfamiliar role of asking rather than telling, of learning rather than judging. I worked to remain open to his efforts while protecting the independence I'd fought to establish. Both of us had to accept that the relationship we were building was different from the one we'd lost. His volunteer work at the VA continued, and he began participating in community events supporting military families. Not grand gestures designed to impress, but quiet, consistent service that suggested genuine commitment. He learned the names of patients who rarely received visitors, remembered details about their service and their struggles, advocated for better resources and programs. "Your father's become quite the advocate," one of the VA coordinators told me when I attended a fundraising event he'd organized. "He really cares about these veterans and understands their needs." The third-party validation mattered because it suggested his transformation was genuine rather than performative. People who worked with him regularly had observed changes in his attitudes and priorities. He was developing authentic relationships within the veteran community rather than simply trying to repair his reputation. During one of our increasingly comfortable conversations, he mentioned a patient he'd been visiting regularly, a former intelligence analyst who'd served in Southeast Asia. He told me about work he did that probably prevented a lot of American deaths, but nobody ever knew about it, Dad said. "Classified stuff that couldn't be recognized publicly. Made me think about your career differently." The connection wasn't subtle, but it represented progress. He was learning to value contributions that didn't generate visible recognition, to respect service that required discretion rather than publicity. The lessons were coming through his own experiences rather than my explanations, which made them more likely to stick. I began to see the possibility of a relationship based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical approval. Not the father-daughter dynamic I'd craved as a young person seeking validation, but an adult relationship between two people who'd learned to appreciate each other's choices and contributions. The transformation wasn't complete, probably never would be. Old patterns don't disappear entirely, and the damage from years of dismissal had left permanent marks. But the foundation for something healthier had been established, built on his genuine understanding rather than my desperate need for acceptance. For years after the ceremony that changed everything, I found myself in a position I'd never expected, genuinely comfortable with my relationship with my father. Not because we'd returned to some idealized past, but because we'd built something new based on honesty and mutual respect. The transformation had been gradual and sometimes painful for both of us. Dad had continued his volunteer work at the VA, eventually becoming a coordinator for family support services. The role suited him. It required the organizational skills and social confidence he'd always possessed, but channeled them toward helping people rather than judging them. He'd found purpose in service, which gave him insight into why I'd chosen a career of service as well. His understanding of military families had deepened through direct experience with their challenges. He'd seen spouses manage deployments, children cope with frequent relocations, and service members balance duty with family responsibilities. The abstract concept of military service had become personal through relationships with people living those realities. "I met a woman yesterday whose daughter is deployed with a cyber warfare unit," he told me during one of our now regular phone calls. "She said she doesn't understand the technical work, but she's proud of her daughter's dedication and expertise." Made me realize that understanding the details isn't as important as trusting the person. The observation represented a fundamental shift in his thinking. For years, he'd withheld respect until he could fully comprehend and evaluate my work. Now he understood that trust and support could exist even in the absence of complete understanding. Military families learned this lesson by necessity. We'd simply taken longer to reach that insight. My own career had continued progressing during this period. I'd been promoted to colonel, assigned to increasingly complex strategic roles, and asked to lead initiatives that drew on my expertise in counterintelligence and international security cooperation. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying, representing the culmination of years of experience and professional development. Dad attended my promotion ceremony, and the contrast with that humiliating recognition event years earlier was striking. He listened attentively to the descriptions of my responsibilities, asked thoughtful questions about military structure, and spoke with genuine pride when other attendees congratulated him on my advancement. No dramatics, no public pronouncements, just quiet dignity and appropriate respect. The ceremony also provided an opportunity for me to reflect on how much had changed since that watershed moment when the general had defended my service. I no longer needed external validation to feel confident in my contributions, but I could appreciate recognition when it came from sources that understood the work involved. Colonel Martinez, who'd been promoted to general during this period, spoke at my ceremony about the evolution of military service and the importance of recognizing diverse forms of leadership and expertise. The officers we honor today represent the complexity and sophistication of modern military operations, she said. Their contributions often go unseen by the public, but they are essential to our national security and our allies' stability. After the ceremony, Dad approached General Martinez to thank her for the recognition and to express his own appreciation for my service. The conversation was brief but respectful, a far cry from the confrontation that had exposed his ignorance years earlier. She later mentioned to me that he'd asked thoughtful questions about military families and the challenges of supporting careers that involve security clearances. Your father seems to have developed real understanding of what military service involves, she observed. That's not always easy for civilian family members. The comment highlighted something I'd learned through this long process. Transformation is possible, but it requires genuine effort and often takes longer than anyone expects. Dad's journey from dismissive critic to informed supporter had taken years and involved consistent work on his part. The volunteer position, the reading, the conversations with veterans and military families, all of it had contributed to his evolving perspective. Our family gatherings had also transformed during this period. Where once Dad had dominated conversations with confident pronouncements about various topics, he now listened more than he spoke. He asked questions rather than offering judgments, sought to understand rather than to instruct. The change was subtle but pervasive, affecting how the entire family interacted. During one holiday dinner, my cousin Sarah mentioned her own struggles with professional recognition in the medical field. Instead of offering immediate advice or drawing comparisons to other people's experiences, Dad listened carefully and asked what kind of support would be most helpful. The response demonstrated patience and empathy that had been largely absent from his earlier approach to family relationships. He's become a better listener, Mom told me privately after that gathering. More thoughtful about other people's experiences. I think the VA work taught him that everyone has struggles that aren't visible from the outside. The insight was accurate and important. Dad's volunteer work had exposed him to veterans dealing with invisible wounds, complex family situations, and challenges that couldn't be resolved through simple advice or confident assertions. He learned to offer presence and support rather than solutions and judgments. This evolution had affected our relationship profoundly. Instead of seeking his approval for my choices, I could now share experiences and challenges knowing that he would listen with genuine interest and offer support without conditions. The dynamic had shifted from hierarchical, parent judging child, to collaborative, adults supporting each other's endeavors. The change was perhaps most evident in how we discussed my work. While operational security still limited what I could share, Dad now understood those constraints and didn't interpret them as evasiveness or lack of trust. He could be proud of my service without needing to know every detail, and he could support my career without fully understanding all its complexities. I'm grateful for what you do, he said during one conversation. Even if I can't know everything about it, I know it matters and I know you're good at it. That's enough for me. The statement represented everything I'd wanted to hear years earlier, but receiving it now felt different than it would have then. I no longer needed his approval to validate my choices, but I could appreciate it as a gift freely given rather than a prize grudgingly earned. Looking back on the long journey from that humiliating ceremony to our current relationship, I recognized that both of us had grown in ways that wouldn't have been possible without the crisis that forced everything into the open. Dad had learned humility, empathy, and respect for experiences different from his own. I had learned independence, boundary setting, and the difference between seeking approval and accepting support. The relationship we'd built wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It was based on who we actually were rather than who we thought we should be or who we wished each other would become. Most importantly, it was sustainable because it didn't require either of us to sacrifice our dignity or authenticity to maintain connection. The general who defended my service that day had done more than vindicate my career. He'd inadvertently created the conditions for genuine reconciliation by forcing both of us to confront uncomfortable truths about our relationship. Sometimes the most valuable interventions are the ones that refuse to allow comfortable deceptions to continue unchallenged. 5 years later, I received orders for a new assignment that would take me overseas for an extended deployment. The position was a significant opportunity, leading a joint task force coordinating intelligence operations across multiple allied nations. It represented recognition of my expertise and trust in my leadership abilities, but it would also mean limited communication with family for months at a time. When I called to tell my parents about the assignment, Dad's response surprised me. Instead of asking about the practical details or expressing concern about the distance, he said, "That sounds like exactly the kind of work you were meant to do. I'm proud that they're trusting you with something so important." The confidence in his voice was genuine, rooted in years of learning about military service and my particular contributions to it. He'd moved from skepticism about my career to authentic pride in my achievements. The transformation hadn't been quick or easy, but it was complete enough that he could offer support without hesitation. "It'll be challenging," I said, "but it's the kind of responsibility I've been preparing for throughout my career." "I know you'll handle it well," he replied. "And I want you to know that we'll be thinking of you, even when we can't talk regularly." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with him asking thoughtful questions about the deployment timeline and expressing genuine interest in the strategic importance of international intelligence cooperation. He didn't push for details I couldn't share, didn't minimize the complexity of the work, and didn't suggest that maybe it was time to consider civilian careers with more predictable schedules. Before the deployment, we had dinner together, just the two of us. Something that rarely happened during my childhood, but had become more common as our relationship improved. He'd chosen a quiet restaurant where we could talk without interruption, and I could see he'd prepared for the conversation. "I want to apologize again," he said after we'd ordered. "Not just for what happened at that ceremony, but for all the years before it. I dismissed your service because I didn't understand it, but I should have trusted your judgment and supported your choices regardless. We've been through this," I said gently. "You've already apologized, and you've shown through your actions that you've changed. I know, but I'm realizing as you're about to deploy again that I wasted years of your career being proud of the wrong things and critical of the right ones. You could have used a father who supported your ambitions instead of questioning them." The regret in his voice was real, but I'd moved beyond needing him to carry that guilt. "We both made mistakes," I said. "I should have set boundaries earlier instead of trying to earn approval that wasn't going to come. But we figured it out eventually." He nodded, then pulled a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. "I wanted to give you this before you leave." Inside was a simple silver compass, engraved with the inscription, "To my daughter, thank you for your service and your patience. Love, Dad." The gift was thoughtful without being overly sentimental, practical while acknowledging the personal significance of the moment. It represented his understanding that my deployment would involve navigation, both literal and metaphorical, and his confidence that I was equipped for the challenges ahead. "I'll carry it with me," I said, "and mend it." During the deployment, our communication was necessarily limited, but the messages we exchanged carried a warmth and mutual respect that hadn't existed during my earlier overseas assignments. He sent brief emails updating me on his VA volunteer work and asking general questions about my well-being. I responded with equally brief notes about the climate, the local culture, and the satisfaction of working with international colleagues. The difference wasn't in the frequency or length of our communication, but in its quality. Neither of us felt the need to prove anything to the other. He wasn't seeking reassurance that I was safe or successful, and I wasn't looking for validation of my choices. We were simply maintaining connection across distance and different time zones. 6 months into the deployment, he sent a longer message describing a ceremony he'd helped organize for VA patients, many of whom had served in intelligence or support roles during their military careers. I made sure to talk about the different ways people serve their country, he wrote. Combat veterans, intelligence specialists, logistics coordinators, communications experts, all of them essential, all of them deserving recognition. The message showed how completely his understanding had evolved. He'd moved from narrow definitions of meaningful service to appreciation for the full spectrum of military contributions. More importantly, he was sharing that broader understanding with other people, helping to educate civilian communities about the complexity of modern military operations. When I returned from the deployment, Dad was waiting at the airport with Mom, both of them beaming with genuine pride and relief. The homecoming wasn't dramatic, no tearful embraces or emotional speeches, but it was warm and comfortable in a way that reflected how much our relationship had matured. "How did it go?" he asked as we walked to the car. "Challenging but successful," I replied. "We accomplished our objectives and built some strong partnerships for future operations." "I'm not surprised," he said. "You've always been good at bringing people together and solving complex problems." The observation was accurate and demonstrated how well he'd come to know my strengths and capabilities. He could see my professional qualities clearly now, without the distortion of previous expectations or disappointments. The drive home was filled with comfortable conversation about family news, his VA activities, and my plans for the next phase of my career. No interrogation about classified details, no attempts to measure my experiences against other people's achievements, no suggestions about what I should do differently. Just genuine interest and support. That evening, as we sat on his back porch watching the sunset, he said something that captured how much had changed between us. "I used to think being a good father meant having all the answers and sharing them whether you wanted them or not. Now I think it means trusting your judgment and being available when you need support." The insight reflected wisdom earned through years of learning, failure, and growth. He discovered that love expressed through control and judgment was less valuable than love offered through trust and acceptance. The lesson had come late in our relationship, but not too late to matter. Looking back now on the long journey from that humiliating ceremony to our current understanding, I can see that both of us had to lose something to gain something better. I had to lose the need for his approval to discover my own strength and independence. He had to lose his confidence in his own judgments to develop genuine empathy and respect for experiences different from his own. The relationship we'd built wasn't the one either of us had imagined years earlier, but it was stronger and more sustainable than what we'd lost. It was based on reality rather than expectations, acceptance rather than approval, and mutual respect rather than hierarchical authority. Sometimes the best outcomes emerge from the worst moments, when crisis forces everyone involved to choose between comfortable deceptions and difficult truths. The general's intervention that day had given us no choice but to confront the dysfunction in our relationship, and we'd both chosen the harder path of genuine change over the easier path of pretending nothing was wrong. The compass he'd given me before my deployment had traveled with me to multiple continents and through countless briefings and operations. But its real significance wasn't navigational, it was symbolic of his faith in my direction and his respect for the journey I'd chosen. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded that sometimes the most valuable support comes not from people who understand everything about your path, but from people who trust you to find your own way. Thanks for staying with me. If this hit home, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that respect isn't optional. Quick questions for you. Have you ever had to set a hard boundary with family? Was there a specific moment that made you finally draw the line? Did anyone step in to back you up, and how did that change things? If you've tried rebuilding trust, what actually helped or didn't? What would you tell your past self before that confrontation? Drop your answers in the comments, I read them.